image as it moves away. I feel the road passes slowly fray.
Hey, it's Edwin Canistracci on a fittingly gray and somber Los Angeles afternoon. Yeah, sometimes it gets gray in LA. You know, these kind of videos I don't like to have to make. I did a Charlie Watts tribute video when he passed away, sadly, and this is a tribute to Mark Lanegan and one of my favorite bands, the Screaming Trees. I was planning on actually doing a Screaming Trees discography review or rank-a-rama. I was probably going to go with the discography review with the Screaming Trees. I think, and I did this with the Melvins video, which was very popular, my Melvins video, where when I'm trying to introduce people to kind of lesser-known acts, like, that's when it's like, I want to kind of break it down for them and explain what's going on with them, because I feel like when it's a bigger band, it's like, yeah, you want to add a little drama to it, and people are curious how I rank this. But when it's a lesser-known band, and I mean, people know this band primarily because of one song, I feel. But on the whole, I don't hear a lot of people talk about the Screaming Trees. I hear more people talk about Mark Lanegan as a solo artist than as the frontman and singer for the Screaming Trees. But even as a solo artist, I feel that Mark Lanegan is definitely has more of a cult following, at least in the States he did. And he's not really known to the general public and to a lot of music listeners. So as a result, I just want to break down the Screaming Trees and their albums and explain them, and kind of just maybe turn on some people to this really great band, I think, and this very underrated band, and to do a tribute to Mark Lanegan, who sadly last week passed away. I'm a huge fan. I was a huge fan. He's one of my favorite vocalists, and even sadly after his death, he'll still continue to be one of my favorite vocalists. I'm reading his memoir right now as we speak. You know, I've been listening to Mark Lanegan and the Screaming Trees all week long in tribute to him. And like I said, I was probably gonna do a Screaming Trees video anyway. I was planning to, because I was listening to them a lot. A year or so ago, I got in a big Screaming Tree kick. During one of the earlier lockdowns, I was trying to fill gaps in my discographies and trying to listen to some bands that I hadn't really listened to that much when I was younger. And I always liked what I heard from the Screaming Trees, and of course I knew their biggest hit, Nearly Lost You, and I had the single soundtrack. And I'll be honest, that album, Sweet Oblivion, back when I was a teenager, because, you know, this was when I was like in high school, I listened to it and it was all right. It just didn't grab me. I think now in retrospect, I listen to Sweet Oblivion and I totally get why teenage Eddie didn't get so into it, especially at that time period, because, you know, this was a time period where there were really big, bold, brash statements in album form, like Nevermind and Dirt and Siamese Dream and Bad Motorfinger. And in the wash of those like really big, bombastic rock statements, Sweet Oblivion is very subtle. It's very mature. It's very kind of middle-aged sounding, you know? It sounds like the album that a band that's been around for 10 years makes. And that's the thing, and we'll get a little more into this when we actually get into Sweet Oblivion, because I'm going to do this chronologically, break down all the albums. But essentially, Screaming Trees were a band that kind of broke after they were kind of done. And that was kind of the sad tragedy of the band and why they never really became as big as I think they should have became, because I think they had the goods. They formed, a lot of people don't realize, they're really more of an 80s band. They formed in the 80s. And like the Melvins and early Soundgarden and Mudhoney and Green River, Mother Love Bone, Screaming Trees are really one of the first bands that really helped create the grunge genre. And I don't think they get brought up enough in that regard. And I really think, and I know Mark Lanegan himself, as I'm learning from this memoir, was not a fan of the Screaming Trees. Even though he was their singer, he hated the band. He didn't like the music. And I do think a lot of that seemed to be clouded by his animosity directed towards the guitarist. Gary Lee Conner, the guitarist and primary songwriter of the band. And let's just say anyone that read Mark's memoir knows what I'm talking about. Kind of similar to the George Lynch, Don Dokken thing, where there's this constant feud between these two guys while they're making their albums right out of the gate. And it's sad because, and like Dokken, it's sad because it's like this band, like while they were riding the wave and making, in my opinion, a lot of great music, they weren't having any fun. They weren't having fun. They were just these guys that just hated each other and did not have fun. So I feel like it's obvious when you read the book that his feelings towards Lee Conner totally spoil his view of this band. He has a real blind spot towards the Screaming Trees, like to the point where people like Kurt Cobain, who he admired and became friends with, would say, "Hey, I love your band, they're great," and he would think to himself, "Why the fuck do you think our shit band's great? You're so much better." And it's just like, dude, you're not getting it? Like, you guys were a really great band. But he didn't get it. Sadly, Mark Lanegan just could not get past his hate of Lee Conner, and as a result, could not appreciate the Screaming Trees. He liked Sweet Oblivion a bit, but he just couldn't wait to get out. And you can hear definitely the singer-songwriter side of him, and the side that was influenced by people like Leonard Cohen and Neil Young and Nick Cave. You could hear that side emerge more in his solo work, and I will touch upon his solo work at the end of this video. But he brought a lot to the Screaming Trees. He was a great vocalist. I think he brought this almost like a scrappy Jim Morrison type quality to the band. And he helped ground them. Yeah, with a different singer, well, we probably wouldn't even know about the Screaming Trees, because I don't think they would have happened. Actually, that's the thing. Lee Conner, he was an offbeat guy. He was an eccentric offbeat guy. It took kind of a scrappy hustler like Mark Lanegan to even get this guy to be on a stage. And then when he was on the stage, he totally rocked out like he was Angus Young. And Lee Conner would run around and headbang and thrash about. And it was quite a spectacle. And I do think it was one of the cool things about the band is visually, they're really cool. Like Lee Conner, he was overweight for, not your typical, you're not used to seeing kind of overweight people in bands. And I do think that hurt them to a degree. Although Mark Lanegan was a good-looking, kind of rugged, good-looking guy, so that would have been enough for the ladies. And he had that wonderful, smoky, honeyed kind of voice, which the ladies like. But it was an interesting contrast. You see this overweight guy spazzing out on the guitar, doing all these cool psychedelic rock licks, and then you got Mark just there, stoically, kind of hazy. It's like perfect contrast. It was great. It was really interesting. So I definitely recommend you. And you got watch him on David Letterman doing Nearly Lost You. And Mark Lanegan has a black eye. I don't want to be I'm glamorizing Mark's issues and his drug addiction, and I don't think he would have liked that. But at the same time, this is how the guy lived. I mean, since he was 12 years old, he was a hustler on the street, and he was gambling and doing drugs and having problems with the cops. And he was like one of these scrappy anti-heroes that a beat poet would want to follow around and write about. It was real. It was authentic. It wasn't like a pose. He wasn't some college boy. Hell, I love Jim Morrison, but Jim Morrison was a college boy. He was a college guy who dropped out, and then, he really lived on the edge, yeah. But Mark Lanegan, that guy, he was that guy. He was a guy that since he was 12 years old, he was from this little redneck Washington shithole town, and it never left him. That's the thing. You read this memoir, and you're like, shit, Mark Lanegan, he's kind of a thug. He's like a romantic rock and roll thug. Maybe he's a guy that you wouldn't trust your woman around, but I'll tell you this though, he's the guy you want to listen to in the wee hours when darkness creeps in around the corners, and you hear his voice and you hear his lyrics, and especially in his solo career, you hear his voice and it makes you know that you're not alone, that others see and touch the darkness sometimes. He's that kind of singer, and during dark times, I listen to his music, and it means a lot to me. And the Screaming Trees mean a lot to me, too. They are different. Mark Lanegan's solo stuff has, I guess you could say, it has a little more substance, and it's a little darker and more existential, but the Screaming Trees are psychedelic, splashy, fun, and metaphysical. I love it. I love their band. I'm a big fan of late 60s garage rock and psychedelia, and Screaming Trees, the way I describe their sound is almost picture if Iggy and the Stooges were psychedelic. If instead of being proto-punk, they were psychedelic, if Iggy and the Stooges were trying to sound like status quo, like Pictures of the Matchstick Man, or trying to sound like early Cream, doing songs like Tales of Brave Ulysses, but in a scrappy Stooges kind of way. That's the thing. It's psychedelic, but psychedelic with a punk rawness. That's the thing about grunge. A lot of people always focus on Sabbath and a lot of that influence, and as they should. Sabbath was a huge influence on grunge, but the Screaming Trees, and I'll talk specifically about the album that I think is really important that no one, including Mark Lanegan, he didn't even talk about the album in his memoir. A very important album that I think was a very big influence on Nirvana and a lot of those early 90s Seattle bands that really gapped the bridge between classic rock and punk rock in a way that I think was very very important towards the formation and evolution of grunge music. So obviously, depending on how much you like grunge, might depend on how much you care about the Screaming Trees. But I will say it's possible to actually not like grunge and like the Screaming Trees. It's not possible to dislike psychedelic rock and like the Screaming Trees. I'll say that. Yeah, you gotta like psychedelic rock, especially the early stuff. You might like Sweet Oblivion if you're into more like rootsy Neil Young kind of rock and roll. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Just give you a little quick biography of the band. Mark Lanegan, they formed the band in his hometown of Ellensburg, Washington, and according to his memoir, it's a real shitty place. Maybe it's better now. Maybe it's been gentrified. But the way he describes it, doesn't sound like a place you'd want to grow up. In a real rough place. Real rough place with kind of hillbillies type people. If you're from there and you take offense to this, I apologize. I'm not saying you're like this or everyone's like this in the town. I'm just going by how Mark Lanegan described it. Just to put it in some context. It's a little like Judas Priest and Black Sabbath coming out of Birmingham. Like this, it's just a rough place, you know? And I think it gives a character to this music. Like I said again, it's like the Stooges if they were doing psychedelic music. Like a lot of psychedelic 60s music was done a lot of times by like art school guys, you know, and college boys and stuff like that. And this is like psychedelic music done by trashy, rednecky Washington guys, you know? So it just has a different vibe. It has an edge to it, a real edge. And a little also like a lot of those bands coming out of Detroit in the early 70s. It has that kind of edge to it. And I love it. I love that kind of edge. And the main songwriter, like I said, is Lee Conner, Gary Lee Conner, real offbeat guy, really, I think kind of a mad genius in a lot of ways. Great guitars, came up with a lot of great hooks and melodies. His brother was the bass player, Van Conner. He did some good backing vocals, good harmonies with Mark. And they had different drummers. Mark Peckerell, hopefully I pronounced that right, I don't know. And then he was replaced later with Barrett Martin. Both really good drummers. I like both of them. I think they're both good drummers. Mark Peckerell was more kind of like a psychedelic drummer. He's a little more experimental and did a lot of fills and stuff. Whereas Barrett Martin, who was primarily a jazz drummer, but a fan of bands like Rush and Led Zeppelin, he kind of brought a kind of bigger, more classic rock sound, a little like what Dave Grohl did with Nirvana. So in a way, he's kind of partially responsible for making the Screaming Trees a little more accessible, actually a lot more accessible with their Sweet Oblivion album. But essentially, if I would say the heart of the band, it's Lee Conner and Mark Lanegan. In the same way, like I said about Dokken, it's like Don Dokken and George Lynch. In a lot of ways, they're like dueling musical visions. That's the heart of the Screaming Trees, you know? You got this one kind of singer with this one kind of guitars, and they're both trying to do music that's not entirely aligning. I think that vision started to align by the third album, and then the fourth album, it totally aligned, and they got a really unique, important sound in 1989 with their album Buzz Factory. But let's start first with their first album, 1986's Clairvoyance. I really like this album. I think it's good. Mark Lanegan thought it was a piece of shit. But I think this was a really, really good album. And they had a deal. They were put out, their first wave of albums were all from SST Records. And I love this label. Usually, if it's on SST Records and it's the late 80s, I'm a fan of that album. It's Greg Ginn from Black Flag, the guitarist and main songwriter of Black Flag, Greg Ginn. It's his label. It was his label. It's still a label. I bought Screaming Trees albums from Greg Ginn. He's living in Texas now, and if you want to get some good SST CDs, they'll mail them right out to you. There's a lot of great stuff. St. Vitus was on them, the Meat Puppets. My favorite Sonic Youth album, Sister, was on SST Records. They're a really great label, and there's a real character to the SST Records, which the early Screaming Tree albums have, which is they're all very hot sounding. To me, that's the SST aesthetic, is that they're kind of hot and fuzzy sounding. They're all kind of springing off of the Stooges' raw power, Iggy and the Stooges' raw power. They all just have this fuzzy, hot sound to them. They just crackle. There's something really exciting about the sound of the SST Records, which I really respond to. And they rock. Greg Ginn, he was not like a punk snob. He loved heavy metal. He loved Sabbath. He was like a rock and roll guy. And so I think that's something he brought to these bands, even artsier bands like Sonic Youth. Like the reason why Sister's my favorite Sonic Youth album is I think it's the one that just balls out rocks the most. It just like he brings that quality out. And that's the thing about a lot of psychedelia from the 60s and early 70s. It's got trippy and it doesn't entirely rock. But the Screaming Trees, they rock. That's the thing. It's like heavy psychedelia. And man, I dig it. You also a little touch of like space rock, early 70s space rock, like Hawkwind, if you like stuff like that. Especially like Sid Barrett, Pink Floyd, Sid Barrett era Pink Floyd, where it was a little more guitar heavy, more of a fuzzy guitar sound, and maybe even a little bit of the earlier Dave Gilmour stuff, like the Nile song. Like if you love the Nile song, hey, you should definitely check out Screaming Trees. And Clairvoyance has that kind of sound, essentially garage rock psychedelia. I guess if I really come down to it, that's what I'd call it. It's like garage rock psychedelia. Orange Airplane, great song. Standing on the Edge, that's probably my favorite song in the album. That's great. The Turning's a really great song. And they just have really great hooks, great melodies. The lyrics at this point are kind of just silly, kind of hippy-dippy lyrics, but they fit, they work. You get this real excitement from this album. It just sounds really fresh and original. It sounds like nothing else in 1986. It's a very original record. I really like this album. I think it's really good. I think it's a good debut. And then you got the second album, Even If and Especially When. This is a good album, released in 87. I like it. It's kind of more of the same. I think this album might have a slight touch of the sophomore slump, but only slightly. I do like the first album a little bit better, and I like several of their later albums more than this album too. So this, I guess, in the Screaming Trees ranking, this probably be like my second. Yeah, I'd say this might like maybe second or third least favorite Screaming Tree albums. But I do like it. I like it. And more or less, if you like the first album, you'll like this album. It's kind of more the same. It might rock a little bit more. Transfiguration, if I'm saying that right, that's a really good song. And The Pathway is really good in rock. And sometimes like with Jefferson Airplane would get a little heavier, like when they got into like kind of a trippy jam, but a little heavier. If you like that shit, you might like this shit too. And just so you know, I am not doing EPs. I'm not doing EPs. I'm not doing compilations. I'm just doing the proper full-length albums. 1988, Invisible Lantern. Now this is where they make, I wouldn't say a huge leap, but they make a solid leap here. It's a solid leap, and this is at this point was their best album yet. This is probably one of the most SST sounding records because it is fuzzy and distorted sounding. Very fuzzy and distorted. It's probably their most SST-ish album. Yeah, I would definitely say it's their most SST-ish album. This is where they lean into the more of the Stooges vibe a little bit more, especially with that first song, Ivy. Amazing song. And this is, like, keep in mind, this is 1988. This is before Nirvana's first album. Listen to Ivy, man. Listen to that song. Kind of like early Mudhoney, Green River, Melvins. This is grunge. This is where, I wouldn't say the first two albums were grungy. They were more just garage psychedelia. But this is the album where you hear kind of a grunge thing happening. It's got that sludgy kind of Stooges sound to it. Badass sounding. It's kind of more of a punk edge on this album than on the other albums. But when they do the psychedelic 60s influenced songs, they're stronger. They have stronger melodies, stronger choruses, stronger hooks. Like Walk Through to This Side is great. Lines and Circles. Amazing song. Great hooks, great melodies. Shadow song. Love that song. That might be my favorite song on the album. That's great. The title track's great. This whole album's great. It's a great album. This is, in my opinion, their first great album. If you're someone that responded to all the ways I described it, you would definitely like it. And this is, to me, their first great album, and an album that makes them more than, they're not like just a nostalgic psychedelic rock group. They're bridging in some other influences and really helping to create what would become grunge. It's right here on this album. But it's even more so on the next album, 1989's Buzz Factory. And Buzz Factory, also a very SST record sounding album, but not quite as much as the last one. This is actually a little more refined. This is at this point probably their most refined sounding album yet. It sounds like the album that a band releases on an independent label right before they're going to go on a major label. And what do you know? That's exactly what it is. Buzz Factory is also my favorite Screaming Trees album. That's right. Easily my favorite Screaming Trees album. I love this album. I can't believe more people don't talk about this album. And in 1989, released the same year as Nirvana's first album, this album is even more in the grunge direction. And you hear right away, out of the gate, with my favorite Screaming Trees song, the lead track, Where the Twain Shall Meet. God, is that song good. It's so catchy. Just comes in that hook, and then Mark's menacing vocals coming in, staggering in with attitude, but like not trying too hard attitude. This song is a scrappy rock and roll gem. I love it. To me, this is like early Stones meet the Stooges. It's just got that rock and roll swagger. I love this song. And that's the thing too. A lot of grunge, and I like a lot of early 90s grunge, but there's not a lot of sex in grunge, in my opinion. Whereas this does, and I think, Lanegan kind of brings that in. There's this kind of Panther-like quality that he has sometimes. I feel that there's a sensuality to this album, and again, kind of like, I know he was a big Iggy Pop fan, so I think a lot of it came from that a bit, where there's this menacing kind of Panther-like sexuality mixed in with this garage rock, and it's bad boy garage psychedelic grunge music, god damn it, and that sounds pretty rockin' to me. So, Where the Twain Shall Meet, awesome song. My favorite Screaming Trees song. In my alternate universe, this is a goddamn hit. This should have been a buzz clip. A buzz clip out of Buzz Factory. God damn it, they even invented the term buzz clip with Buzz Factory. For God's sake, this is really where the 90s begin. I think even more so than Bleach a little bit. And Bleach was Nirvana's first album that came out the same year. That's a great album, but I think this album's stronger and I think hookier. And yeah, I mean, that had About a Girl, which was of course very hooky and foreshadowed Nevermind. But overall, I think this is the hookier, catchier album. All the songs, the melodies, the hooks, the band is focused on this album. Their most focused album yet. Windows, really catchy song. Black Sun Morning, really catchy. And hey, that's like Black Hole Sun. What do you know? Tell you, this band was so influential in that scene. All those guys hanged out with Mark Lanegan. He was hanging around Seattle. He was part of that whole scene. And unsung. He was an unsung force in the band. Screaming Trees were an unsung force in the Seattle scene. Even the Melvins have a lot of respect now. They have a very strong, loyal cult following, which I don't quite see enough people talk about the Screaming Trees and Lanegan. They were really an important band in my opinion. And Black Sun Morning, such a catchy song. My third favorite song on the album actually. Great song. And they kind of would redo it later as another song, which I'll talk about later. But anyway, Black Sun Morning, great song, dark, menacing, catchy, Too Far Away, beautiful song. And this is another song where you hear Mark Lanegan having some more influence in the songwriting, I could tell. It sounds like a foreshadowing of some of his solo stuff. It's just kind of a beautiful, wistful rock ballad, but it's not really about, it's hard to say. It's a little indie rockish. It's just wistful. It's a tuneful, wistful indie rock song. That's how I would describe it. That's my second favorite song on the album. Subtle Poison, great song. Sounds a lot like Nirvana. And sometimes Mark Lanegan singing sounds like, and Kurt Cobain, hey, I'm a Nirvana fan, but Kurt Cobain took a lot from Cheap Trick, he took a lot from the Replacements, he took a lot from the Pixies, he also took a lot from the Screaming Trees. Subtle Poison, you hear it and you go, well, yeah, that's definitely a song that you can hear influence Nirvana. It's just this catchy, dark punk song, but catchy. There's hooks to it. Really great. The second half, I would say the first half is a little more the Lanegan side, and the second half is more Connor side, because the second half is a little back to the hippy-dippy psychedelic garage rock stuff, but it's all good, but still more focused. All the songs are much shorter and snappier and catchier than they've been on all the prior albums. Love End of the Universe. Man, that song's badass tune, rockin', hooks, melodies, Buzz Factory. More people need to listen to this album. I could just gush on and on about Buzz Factory. One of my favorite albums from the late 80s. It should definitely be recognized far more than it is. This to me is a seminal underground record that foreshadowed what music was going to sound like, popular music was going to sound like just a couple of years later. And then is their major label debut. They finally got signed to a major label. They got signed to Epic Records and they did their major label debut, Uncle Anesthesia, my second favorite Screaming Trees album. And I would say objectively probably their best album. Like if I was to give someone a Screaming Trees album, it'd probably be this or the next one, depending on their taste. If you like psychedelic rock, this would be a good entry point in, and then go backwards and forward. This would be a good first album to start with, because it's a lot like what they were doing on the last prior albums, but it is the production's a little bit better. I personally like those SST fuzzy, distorted productions. That's not going to be for everyone though. So this is definitely better for people that like classic rock because it's produced in a more conventional way. But there's nothing conventional about the songwriting. Man, if anything, their songwriting's taken to another level beyond this horizon. Great, epic psychedelic rock song. I think they're leaning into the heaviness even more. Again, more of the grunge influence, a little touch of metal on this album. It's just a little heavier than they were in prior albums. And before I would say it was more punk, garage punk, and now they're getting a little bit more of that metal sound. But then the second song, Bed of Roses. Goddamn, Bed of Roses is one of the most beautiful. To me, this is pop rock. Some people listen to it and call it college rock or indie rock or whatever. But to me, this should have been a hit. This should have been a huge song. In fact, I feel like if this song was the follow-up single to Nearly Lost You and it was on the next album, it would have been a big hit. And I'll talk more about this when we get to Sweet Oblivion. But I think that was the kind of thing that was lacking on that album, is that they didn't have a second song as catchy as the first song. And that's the thing that really helps push an album. The kind of thing that really helps to push a band to be more than a one-hit wonder is having an album that has multiple hits. And they unfortunately didn't have that. They didn't have an album that had multiple hits. And Bed of Roses was just, it was a little too soon. They just missed it like by a year. 91 was when grunge was, Nevermind was released, but it was a slow burn. A lot of people don't remember this about Nevermind, is it didn't break right away. It was out for months before it broke. And this was a period where this genre was not entirely proven yet. A lot of these bands were getting signed major label deals, and people in the know were hip to it, and people saw the Seattle scene was going to be a big thing, and a lot of these bands from this part of the country, in Washington, they saw the writing on the wall. But Screaming Trees they just kind of missed it. Bed of Roses just missed it by about a year. That's the thing. People weren't quite listening to this kind of stuff. And the videos, maybe not high concept enough to get attention. That's what I think. In the early 90s was still a period where the videos mattered. Like, the videos really did help push a single and album. So I do think that's another reason why Bed of Roses didn't become the hit that it should have been. But man, the melodies, Mark's honeyed, smoky, wistful, beautiful voice over this great music and the melodies. Uncle Anesthesia, the title track, catchy song. If there's a major influence in Lee Connor's life, it had to be, I'm guessing, when he was a little kid and heard Pictures of the Matchstick Man by Status Quo. And you even hear that a little bit in their biggest hit, Nearly Lost You. I think that was a very important song to him growing up as a kid, because you always hear that melody kind of popping up a lot in his stuff. And this has that kind of vibe. It has that kind of Pictures of the Matchstick Man vibe. It's very catchy. Great hooks, great melody. It's a fun song. It's a fun psychedelic rock song. I love it. Caught Between. Amazing song. Caught Between. This is my second. I say Bed of Roses is my third favorite song on the album. This is my second favorite song on the album. Just a really catchy, melodic. I guess it's kind of a grungy, but kind of poppy too. It's like a poppy grunge modern rock song. That's all I can say. Modern rock song. It has a very unique sound. That's the thing. Screaming Trees did have a sound. It sounds like a catchy Screaming Trees song. Something also that I think could have possibly been a single. A really catchy song. Before We Arise, that's my favorite song on the album. Man, is this song dark. Now this is kind of doomy and slow and menacing. It's a dirge. It's a dark dirge. And again, I'd say this is an important early 90s grunge song. 91 was a year where everything kind of shifts, but like Screaming Trees were already a little ahead of the curve here. They were already doing some stuff like this. Amazing song. Mark's vocals, amazing. Dude was a fucking panther. Dark, brutal heart of man is all over this song. Before We Rise, love it. Second half of the album, good. Again, we get into a lot of psychedelic stuff. Time for Light, it's a real rockin' song. Got fast, heavy, kind of metal psychedelia. Disappearing's great. Ocean of Confusion's great. Closer's great. This whole album's great. It's a great album. Easily my second favorite Screaming Trees album. And I think a great entry point, especially if you're a fan of psychedelic rock, then you need to buy Uncle Anesthesia. And then we get into the following year, 92, and this is their biggest album, Sweet Oblivion. Now this is the album that has their one big hit, Nearly Lost You. I don't hear so many people talk about this song, but if there is a song that anyone remembered from the Screaming Trees, it would be Nearly Lost You, and that's primarily because it was featured on the single soundtrack. It was both the lead-off single for this, but it was also coinciding as the third, I think it was like the third or fourth single from the single soundtrack. By that point, the single soundtrack was already a big deal. I owned a copy of it. I'm going to do a video just about the single soundtrack at some point, so I don't want to talk about that so much. But that was a really huge soundtrack that was really important to a lot of us teenagers in the 90s. And that was really where grunge, in a lot of ways, I think peaked. Maybe people say maybe it was the following year, 93, but I consider 92 the peak of grunge. And the single soundtrack was a big part of it. Soundgarden had songs, and Pearl Jam, and of course that's where Alice in Chains with Wood, that was first on the single soundtrack before it was on Dirt, and that was a big hit. And this song was played a lot on MTV. Nearly Lost You was a hit. Maybe mainly on modern rock stations, but it was all over modern rock stations, and it was all over MTV, and it was a great song, and it was the first time I heard the Screaming Trees, and I love that song. Very fitting for a psychedelic rock band. One of my memories of this song, which I've never entirely shook, I wouldn't say it's like an acid flashback, but it calls back a memory of it. In my Beatles video, I talked about how the first time I took acid, I listened to the White Album for the first time. I listened to the first disc of the White Album while I was tripping, and then the next day, when I was coming down, I listened to the second disc of the White Album for the first time. But I had to go and do some work with my father's shop. My father had a drapery shop in Trenton, Jersey. Well, Morrisville, New Jersey, which is like right on the border of Trenton. And he had a drapery shop there. And I had to go in and help him out and assist. And I was still kind of coming down a little bit from the acid. I remember coming back home and listening to the single soundtrack, and I still had a little bit of this feeling, and I was like, oh, I haven't shooken off the acid yet. And I listened to Nearly Lost You, and this was the time that song was being played a lot on MTV, and I listened to this song a lot in the single soundtrack. It was my favorite song on the single soundtrack. So what I'm rambling on about is I went back home after, working at my dad's shop. I went back home and was still kind of feeling like the last traces of the acid, like the last traces were leaving, and they kind of left with this song. Like there was a little bit of that feeling hanging over when I listened to the song, and then by the time the song was done, it was like, it was gone, like no more acid, like, it's out of my body. So whenever I hear this song, I kind of thinking about coming down, and it brings that feeling. It brings that feeling of crazy psychedelic adolescent shenanigans. That's the thing about a song. Like some songs it just captures a moment in time. And yeah, it stirs just feelings of, that time. It was an exciting time. I'm in high school. It's 92. There's this exciting new music scene happening that I'm all caught up in, the Seattle scene and all this music. I have a very positive association with the song. But you know what? That all aside, it's just a crackerjack song. It's just a top-notch pop rock song. It's no surprise that this song was a big hit. It's catchy as hell. It's just a catchy, good, classic rock song with a hint of psychedelia. This is the thing about this album. This is the album where they get for the first time Barrett Martin. And Barrett Martin does help. He helps kind of bring a more kind of conventional hard rock sound to the band. He kind of keeps them from getting too trippy and out there. Plus the band, overall, even Lee Connor, it sounds like, they're mellowing out. Definitely not as hard rocking and as out there as Uncle Anastasia, and definitely not as much as the earlier SST albums. This is definitely a more reined in and mature, and definitely foreshadows more of what like Mark Lanegan would kind of do. Rootsier music. It's a rootsier album. I would say like there are hints of psychedelia here and there, but I'd say for the most part this is more like a kind of rootsy Neil Young and Crazy Horse style rock. Like if you're a fan of Neil Young and Crazy Horse and that kind of music, and maybe even some southern rock, I think you could like this album. There's a little bit of psychedelia, you hear it. A Shadow of the Season, that's a kind of hard rock and psychedelic kind of grungy song. Goes into Nearly Lost You. A classic pop rock song in my opinion. Should be even more remembered and renowned than it is. To me, it's one of the great early 90s singles. Dollar Bill, which was the failed follow-up single, didn't really do much, but really good song. But like I said, imagine if Bed of Roses was on this album and that was released after Nearly Lost You. To me, that's the thing that really would have pushed this album and Screaming Trees over the edge, commercially speaking. But still, there are great songs. In fact, I would say my favorite songs, Nearly Lost You, as great as it is, probably I'd say that's like my third favorite song on the album. My favorite song is More or Less. More or Less. It's an amazing song. Very Neil Youngish, kind of Zuma era Neil Young, which I love. Great guitar hook, great melody. That's great. Also, like Winter Song's a really great song. Has a little bit of that vibe of like the Stones song Winter, which I love. Winter from my favorite Stones album, Goat's Head Soup. It has a little bit of that early 70s kind of Stonesy kind of, like a Stonesy kind of early 70s scrappy bout vibe. Love it. No One Knows. That's my second favorite song on the album. No One Knows, just a great kind of rootsy indie rock song. Great melody, great hooks, a lot of emotion. Mark sounds great. Mark sounds great throughout this whole album. Julie Paradise, that's kind of the most psychedelic, kind of Lee Connor-ish kind of song on this album. And that's cool. And there's a great deluxe edition. This is the only Screaming Trees album because it's their biggest album because of Nearly Lost You. As a result, it got remastered and there's bonus tracks, and bonus tracks are all good. So I definitely recommend that deluxe edition. And I really like this album. Actually, I love this album. I think it's a great album. But I can tell you, I get why when Teenage Eddie listened to this album after the single soundtrack, I sampled it from a friend. I remember being underwhelmed by it. I gotta tell you, I was just too immature and young to really appreciate this album, which has more of a subtle gravitas to it. Now I appreciate it, but I can kind of see why this album wouldn't explode as much as the others. In fact, even if, let's just reverse it. Let's just say that Uncle Anesthesia was released in 92, but had Nearly Lost You on it as a single. I feel like that would have popped more because that album was heavier and a little splashier. Like I said, this album was just a little too mature and a little too subtle to really hook in us grungy teenagers, I think, the way that it needed to. But now, as a middle-aged man, I love this album and I really appreciate it. It just shows that this is a band that really, had different sides and were growing and maturing. And even though I might like the 3 albums prior better, I do love this album, and I'd say it's my 4th favorite Screaming Trees album. It's great. Then they don't release an album for a while, which is another thing that I think obviously hurt their career. They didn't jump on the momentum of this album. They didn't really pounce on the opportunity, and they released the follow-up, Dust, which is a very catchy, well-produced, melodic hard rock album, but they didn't release it until 1996. Whoa! In pop music years, that's an eternity. Man, they waited way too long to release this album. And I gotta say, for the most part, this was the right album to release. It just should have came out in 1993. If this album came out in 1993, I think All I Know might have been a hit song. And I think they might have built on what they started to build with Sweet Oblivion. But they waited until 1996. Grunge was already done by that point. People were already into the Spice Girls and ska. Life had moved on. So they just missed that boat. But they released the right album, just too late. Because this album, it's a very catchy commercial. And in some ways, a little more rockin' than Sweet Oblivion. I really like it. I don't think it's as good as Sweet Oblivion. I think that it's a tad more formulaic in spots. It feels like a band that's going in there that's kind of like a slick machine at this point. They kind of know what they're doing. So there's not that feeling of discovery anymore like you had with all their previous albums. But still, it's a solid album. It's a solid, catchy melodic with hints of psychedelia rock album. Halo of Ashes, kind of a trippy, kind of Middle Eastern song, and Mark Lanegan would have some songs kind of like this, a little Zeppelin-esque in his solo career. And then you have the single, the song that I think they all thought was going to be a big hit, All I Know, which to me is a reworking of Black Sun Morning. It sounds very similar to that. It has a similar kind of vibe, similar kind of chord progression, but they just made it a little slicker, a little more commercial. And it's a catchy song. It sounds like it would have been a potential hit if they had like maybe a splashier video than the performance video that they had. If they had kind of a cool video for this and this came out in 93, might have been a hit for them. Dying Days. It's crazy because Dying Days just totally rips off Tales of Brave Ulysses during the verses. They just play the same chord. So it's the same exact chord progression as that song. But you know what? I love that song. So I don't mind hearing it again. And it's a great song. In fact, I would say Dying Days is probably, that's my favorite song on the album. Great song, great ripoff. Great ripoff, guys. Good job. Sworn and Broken's great. It's a good album with some great moments. It's solid. If you like Sweet Oblivion, it's kind of like Sweet Oblivion Part 2, maybe a little more trippy and rockin' in spots. It's a good album, but I would say I would put the 4 albums before it ahead of it. I'd probably put it a little ahead of their first 2 albums. And then we get to the final album, which really Dust is the final album if we're talking about albums that were released when the band was actually an active band. This was an album that they had started recording in the late 90s, but then abandoned. They abandoned this album, they lost their record deal, and Mark Lanegan, couldn't get out of the Screaming Trees fast enough. So this album kind of just got lost in the shuffle, and it was never released until many years later. The drummer Barrett Martin finally released it somehow. I don't know how exactly. I don't know the whole story. I think he just created his own label. Yeah, I'm looking at this. Yeah, he created his own label and then released this album. And I'd say it is the weakest Screaming Trees album, but I don't think they have a bad album in their discography. It's a good album. I like it. Yeah, I'd say it's their weakest. It's definitely their most derivative. It sounds like what it is. It sounds like a band that they all got like one foot out the door. You know, it sounds like a less inspired Dust and Sweet Oblivion. It's kind of like part 3. It's like if it's a trilogy, it's of their more mainstream classic rock sound. This would be the third part, but it just doesn't, it's not as inspired as the other 2 albums were. But if you like that sound, if you like that kind of psychedelic classic rock kind of rootsy sound, then you'll like it. And there's still good melodies and hooks. It's more kind of like you just feel that this album's uninspired, but the songs are there. There are decent songs here. I really love Black Rose Way. That's a really great song, and the lead-off song Ash Gray Sunday is really catchy, 60s style garage rock song. There's some great melodies. It's a good album. Like I said, solid album, but definitely their weakest album. And then sadly, that's it for the Screaming Trees. And I'm sure at some point I will do a Mark Lanegan discography review as well, because he's one of my favorite artists, one of my favorite singers. Rest in peace. It's really sad. Man lived a troubled, tragic life, as I'm learning about in this memoir. He was a dark guy. Let's just say that. He's a dark guy, but man, he had an amazing voice, and sometimes that's the thing. You can safely kind of tip your toes in the darkness through artists, and that's the gift of artists that dare to live these kind of lives and then come back and sing about it and reflect our lives in ways too, even if they live perhaps darker, more nihilistic existences that we do. They still could mirror the chaos that's in our soul and what we see in the world around us. And Mark Lanegan is one of those kind of artists. He was a very important artist. I think a very unsung artist. One of the great singers from the late 80s and 1990s and into the early and mid 2000s. This guy had an amazing voice. And the Screaming Trees were an amazing, innovative, idiosyncratic rock band that, again, if you like grunge, if you like psychedelic rock, if you like punk, if you like garage rock, if you like rootsy classic rock, if you like all that stuff, definitely start listening to some Screaming Trees albums, because they're a really great band and they're very unsung. So that's it. So that's my Screaming Trees discography review and tribute to Mark Lanegan. And thank you for watching my video. Rock on.